On the morning of the 29th of November, 1781, the crew of a British merchant vessel called the Zong began throwing people into the sea. Not one person, not a few. Over the course of 3 days, they threw 132 people overboard. Some were already dying, weakened by 11 weeks in the hold, by the heat, by the dysentery that had been moving through the bodies packed below decks since the ship left West Africa. Some were not dying. Some were healthy enough that when they understood what was happening, when the crew came for them, they fought. Some jumped. A record exists of 10 people thrown into the ocean with their hands still shackled. The ship's captain was a man named Luke Collingwood. He was not a monster in any way that distinguished him from his profession. He was a merchant mariner running a legal trade on a well-established route, and the decision he made in late November 1781 was, within the logic of that trade, a business decision. Here is the logic. The Zong had left West Africa with 442 people in a hold designed for far fewer. A navigational error had extended the voyage by weeks, water was running critically low, people were dying, and Collingwood understood something about the insurance policy the ship carried, something that shaped every calculation he made in those final days. If the people in the hold died of disease or dehydration, the loss fell on the ship's owners. Dead cargo was the owner's problem. The insurance did not cover it, but the policy covered cargo lost at sea. Specifically, cargo thrown overboard in an emergency, when the safety of the vessel required it. 132 people thrown into the Atlantic Ocean were worth £30 each under the terms of the policy. Alive and dying in the hold, they were a liability. Dead in the water, they were a claim. Collingwood filed the claim, the case went to court. The argument on both sides was about maritime insurance law. The technical question of whether the emergency had been genuine, whether the captain had acted within his legal authority. The people who had been thrown into the ocean were referred to throughout the proceedings as cargo. The court, in its first ruling, found for the ship's owners. An abolitionist named Granville Sharp pushed for a retrial. He argued that the proceedings were not about insurance, but about murder. The retrial was ordered. The owners ultimately did not collect, but no one was charged with a crime. The 132 people were, in the legal record, cargo that had been disposed of. The dispute was about who bore the financial cost of the disposal, not whether it was murder, whether the insurance paid out. Sit with that for a moment, not with the horror of it. The horror is available and you can find it easily, but with the structure of it. A civilization had built a system so complete, so internally coherent, so thoroughly rationalized at every level, from the insurance policy to the courtroom to the parliamentary debates that would follow, that the killing of 132 people could be processed as a question of contract law. The people were not invisible. They were legible. They appeared in the proceedings. They simply appeared in a column of the ledger where human beings became units of insurable value. And the column next to that one, the column where their deaths might register as something other than a financial dispute, was not part of the document. This is the story of that document, of the empire that produced it, of the 300 years it took to build the machine that could generate that court case as a routine matter of commerce, and of what it cost everyone, the people in the hold, the people on the deck, the people in the counting houses in London, and the people still paying the bill today, to run it. There is a map in the British Foreign Office that was printed in 1920. It shows the world as the British government wanted to see it. And for one brief, strange moment in history, the world more or less complied. Roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface is shaded red. Canada, red. Australia, red. India, red. Nigeria, Kenya, Rhodesia, Egypt, Malaya, Burma, Palestine, Hong Kong, Cyprus, Jamaica, Trinidad, red. Bleeding across the continents like a wound that refuses to close. 13.7 million square miles. 412 million people, every ocean, simultaneously. No empire in human history had ever controlled this much of the planet's surface. Not Rome, not the Mongols, not the Ottomans, who at their height had held the crossroads of the world and still could not approach these numbers. The British Empire of 1920 was the largest political structure ever assembled by human beings, measured by territory or by the count of souls who lived inside it. The man most responsible for its continued existence at that moment was David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, a sharp, mercurial Welshman who had led Britain through the final years of the First World War and emerged into the peace conference at Versailles, where the victorious powers sat down to redraw the world. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Britain absorbed most of its Middle Eastern territories. When Germany's African colonies were redistributed, Britain took the lion's share. In a single decade, the empire grew by approximately 1.8 million square miles. The map grew redder. Lloyd George stood at the peak of the largest empire in history. He understood, with the clarity that intelligent men sometimes achieve and then immediately suppress, that this peak was also the beginning of the descent. Britain had spent £11 billion fighting the First World War. Most of it was borrowed. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, Britain owed more than it owned. And the creditor was America, a former colony that had been quietly accumulating the world's gold reserves while Europe burned through its. The war had consumed a generation of men, destabilized the industrial base, and revealed, to anyone paying close attention, that the empire's fundamental operating mechanism, the ability to project force to any point on Earth and sustain it indefinitely, was far more fragile than the red map suggested. The map was true. The map was also a lie. It showed territory, but not the cost of holding it. It showed extent, but not exhaustion. It showed the empire at its greatest breadth and concealed, in the blankness between the red, the thing that would eventually destroy it. The gap between what the empire claimed and what it could actually afford. That gap did not begin in 1920. It did not begin with the First World War or the East India Company or the first slave ship out of West Africa. It began with a structure, a way of organizing profit and loss that was so elegant, so durable, and so thoroughly embedded in every institution the empire built, that it persisted for 300 years across every change of government, every shift of ideology, every reform that was supposed to fix it. The structure was this. The empire found mechanisms to keep the profits visible and the costs somewhere else. The profits went into ledgers, into dividends, into the country houses of England, and the endowments of its universities. The costs went into the bodies of people the ledger was not designed to count. Into the famines the accounting did not record as expenditures, into the borders drawn by men who had never visited the lands they were dividing, into the compensation paid when slavery was abolished to the slaveholders, not the enslaved, into a court case about whether an insurance policy covered 132 people thrown into the sea. This is not a story about British evil. Evil is too small a frame for what this actually was. The people who built and ran the British Empire were not in the main different from the people who built and ran every other large human enterprise. They were ambitious and pragmatic and self-interested and occasionally genuinely idealistic. They operated inside a system whose logic they had largely inherited and only partially examined. The horror of the Zong was not that Luke Collingwood was uniquely monstrous. It was that the system he operated inside had made his calculation rational, had made it, in the specific language of the insurance policy and the court, legitimate. Systems that make atrocity rational are the most dangerous things human civilizations produce. They are dangerous precisely because they do not require villains. They require only people doing their jobs inside a logic they have not stepped outside of long enough to question. The British Empire was that system, operating at civilizational scale for 300 years. This is its story. It begins not in 1920, not at the peak, but more than 3 centuries earlier, with a small island and a bankrupt queen and a problem that no honest accounting could solve. England in 1600 was not a great power. This requires some insistence. The history of the British Empire is almost always told from the height of what it eventually became, as though the island always had this destiny, as though empire was the natural expression of something latent in the English character, some genius for administration and organized violence that was simply waiting for the right moment to announce itself. The empire's own historians encouraged this view. It served a purpose. An empire that was always going to happen needs less explaining than one that happened through a specific sequence of choices, pressures, and accidents that could, in principle, have led somewhere else entirely. So forget for a moment the later enormity. Look at the island as it actually was. In 1600, England has a population of roughly 4 million people. That is approximately the size of present-day Los Angeles County. The country is predominantly agricultural. London is the one city of genuine scale, perhaps 200,000 people, magnificent and terrible in the way cities always are when they grow faster than the infrastructure meant to contain them. The streets run with a mixture of mud and animal waste. The Thames, the city's artery and its sewer simultaneously, carries the smell of what it is. The houses lean toward each other across narrow lanes, as though conspiring. The plague returns every decade or so and removes a portion of the population the city then slowly replenishes. Beyond London, England is fields. It is market towns with a church and a weekly market and a memory of the last bad harvest. It is a countryside that has been farmed and refarmed and farmed again until every field carries the ghost of older fields beneath it. A third of children die before the age of 5. A woman faces mortality every time she gives birth. A bad harvest, and there were bad harvests regularly in a climate significantly colder than now, produces hunger that reaches beyond the poor and into the middling classes. The proximity to death is not experienced as exceptional. It is simply the texture of life. In the parish register of Gotham, Nottinghamshire, a village so unremarkable that its name became a byword for foolishness, the entries for the winter of 1596 read like a tolling bell. November. Thomas Brown, laborer, buried. His wife Margaret, yet buried 4 days later. Their infant, unnamed in the record, buried the same week. The harvest that year had failed across much of England. The price of wheat doubled, then doubled again. The register does not say whether the Browns starved or sickened, whether the infant went first or last, whether anyone was with them. The record closes around them and moves on to the next entry. This is ordinary English life in 1600. It is not poverty in any political sense. It is simply the condition of a small agricultural island on the northwestern edge of Europe, watched by no one in particular, envied by no one at all. And then there is the class of people for whom things are different. The landed gentry, the merchant families of London and Bristol, the lawyers and physicians and clergy who cluster around institutions. These people eat well, sometimes lavishly. Their children die at lower rates. They read. Some travel. A small number are genuinely cosmopolitan, fluent in Latin or French or Italian, aware of what is happening in the wider European world. What is happening in the wider European world is this. It is getting rich, at a scale that England cannot match and can barely comprehend. And the mechanism of that enrichment is trade. Spain is extracting silver and gold from the Americas in quantities so vast that the global price of silver has collapsed from sheer supply volume, creating an inflationary spiral across Europe that economists are only beginning to understand. The Spanish crown receives something like 35 million pesos per year from its American colonies, a figure that makes the revenues of every other European monarch look like the accounts of a prosperous farmer. Fleets of galleons crossed the Atlantic on a schedule. The treasure fleets sailing from Havana to Seville, carrying silver from the mines of Peru and Mexico in quantities that make the ships sit visibly lower in the water. Portugal controls the spice trade through a chain of fortified trading posts stretching from Lisbon to Goa to Malacca to Macau, a maritime infrastructure built over a century of navigation, diplomacy, and sustained violence. In an era before refrigeration, spices are not a luxury. They are the technology by which meat is preserved across a winter, by which the smell of decay is managed, by which eating remains possible when the alternative is not. The Portuguese have positioned themselves between the source and every market in Europe. The margins are extraordinary. The Dutch are constructing what will become the most sophisticated commercial empire of the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company, which will eventually hold a monopoly on trade across a vast expanse of Southeast Asia and return dividends to its shareholders that remain, in real terms, among the highest in the history of commerce. They are doing this while simultaneously fighting a war of independence against Spain on land that is technically below sea level. They have figured something out that the rest of Europe is still attempting to understand. England is watching all of this from the edge. The anxiety this produces is not merely economic. It is the specific anxiety of a civilization that measures itself against others and finds itself falling short. English merchants travel to the spice ports and pay Portuguese prices. English ships cross the Atlantic and find the best harbors already claimed. English investors fund expeditions that return with enthusiasm but not profit. The gap between what England can see being done and what England can actually do is experienced by the people educated enough to perceive it and wealthy enough to care as something close to humiliation. At the center of that anxiety sits Elizabeth I, 42 years into her reign, 67 years old, aging in ways she finds politically inconvenient and attempts to conceal with increasing quantities of white face paint and auburn wigs. She has never married, never produced an heir. The succession question has hung over her reign for 4 decades like a slow-moving weather system. She is also broke. This is the fact that drives everything. The Crown's finances are in chronic distress. England has no central bank, no bond market of the kind developing in Amsterdam, no reliable mechanism for converting future revenue into present capital. The Crown raises money primarily through taxation, which Parliament must approve, and Parliament has spent centuries treating tax approval as an opportunity to extract political concessions. The relationship between Crown and Parliament over money is a permanent negotiation, sometimes cooperative, often hostile, always constrained. Elizabeth wants to project power. She cannot afford to. She watches the Spanish treasure fleets and cannot build the navy to threaten them. She watches the Portuguese spice monopoly and cannot fund the expeditions to break into it. She wants to compete with the great powers of the continent and does not have the balance sheet to do it. Here, in this specific constraint, this gap between ambition and resource, is where the logic that builds the largest empire in history first takes shape. If you cannot afford to project power yourself, you find someone who will project it for you. If you cannot put your name on the enterprise, you find a structure where the profits flow back to you while the risks stay with someone else. You license the aggression. You create an arrangement where private individuals bear the cost of actions that serve public purposes and where the accounting keeps those two things, the private cost, the public benefit, carefully separated. Someone else takes the risk. You take the reward. Someone else pays. Elizabeth had in Francis Drake the perfect instrument for this. Drake was a Devon man, born into a tenant farming family in the 1540s, who went to sea as a teenager and discovered a particular aptitude for it. Not just the navigation and seamanship, which he mastered quickly, but for the violence that ocean commerce in the 16th century required. He made his early career in the slave trade, carrying West Africans across the Atlantic to Spanish colonies in a business that was profitable, brutal, and already well established by the time Drake entered it. He was not unusual in this. He would become unusual later. His defining moment came in 1568. The trading expedition led by his cousin John Hawkins was caught in the harbor at San Juan de Ulua on the Mexican coast by a Spanish naval fleet. The Spanish attacked without warning in violation of what Hawkins understood to be an agreement. They destroyed most of the English fleet. Drake escaped. He did not forget. What followed was a career of systematic plunder against Spanish shipping and colonial settlements across the Caribbean and along the Pacific coast of South America, plunder on a scale that transformed Drake from a Devon sailor into one of the wealthiest men in England. He raided, he captured, he disrupted the Spanish colonial supply chains that Elizabeth's treasury could not afford to disrupt through any conventional military means. The question of whether this was piracy or warfare was one Elizabeth handled with characteristic precision. She handled it by refusing to answer it. Drake operated under letters of reprisal, documents authorizing him to seek redress for the losses at San Juan de Ulua. This gave his operations a thin legal coating without formally committing the crown to anything. A piece of paper between the Queen and the reality of what her privateer was doing in the Atlantic. When Drake returned from his circumnavigation of the globe in 1580, carrying 600,000 pounds worth of Spanish treasure, roughly half of Elizabeth's annual government revenue, she knighted him on the deck of his ship, the Golden Hind. Spain protested. Elizabeth expressed polite regret. She had already moved her share of the treasure to the Tower of London before the ceremony began. Drake took the risks. Drake's crew died of scurvy and cannon fire and the 1,000 infections that 16th century sailors died of. The Crown received its share of the proceeds while maintaining enough distance from the enterprise that it could not be formally held responsible for what the enterprise actually was. Someone else paid. The Crown collected. On the 4th of April, 1581, Elizabeth stepped aboard the Golden Hind, where it sat in the Thames at Deptford, surrounded by a crowd estimated at several thousand. The ship was small, 70 feet long, barely credible as the vessel that had just circumnavigated the globe. The treasure was no longer aboard. Thus Elizabeth had already moved her share, some 160,000 pounds, to the Tower before the ceremony began. What remained was the theater of the thing, the Queen, the captain, the golden sword. Drake knelt. She touched his shoulders. The crowd cheered. Spain's ambassador watched from nearby with an expression that diplomatic correspondence describes, with considerable restraint, as displeased. In the margins of the ledger, in the places where the dead sailors were not recorded, where the enslaved Africans Drake had carried across the Atlantic did not appear, where the disrupted lives of everyone who happened to be between an English privateer and a Spanish treasure ship were not tallied, the real costs of the enterprise were already accumulating. But margins are easy to ignore, especially when the main columns are in surplus. 3 years after Elizabeth knighted Drake, a group of London merchants came to her with a proposal. They wanted a monopoly on trade with the East Indies. They had capital. They had ships. What they needed was a royal charter, the Crown's formal blessing, the legal standing that would transform a commercial venture into something with the implicit backing of English state power if things went wrong in ways that required more than merchants could manage. Elizabeth signed the charter on the 31st of December, 1600. The last day of a century and the last meaningful year of her reign. She would be dead in 3 years, the succession still unresolved, the court already angling toward James in Edinburgh. The document was unremarkable in appearance. Vellum, wax seal, formal language of royal grants. The men who received it were merchants, wool traders, cloth merchants, a few with experience in the Levant trade. Men who kept careful accounts and thought in terms of cargo manifests and profit margins. They were not thinking about empire, They were thinking about pepper. The East India Company was born. The mechanism Drake had demonstrated, private capital bearing the risk, the crown taking the reward, the costs landing somewhere the ledger did not look, was formalized, institutionalized, and pointed eastward. Elizabeth had created a corporation with a monopoly and a charter, and the implicit power of the English state behind it, pointed at a subcontinent of 150 million people with no particular plan for what came next. The company was not sent to conquer India, and it was sent to buy pepper. What it found instead would take a century and a half to fully reveal itself. And when it did, the mechanism that Drake had first demonstrated in the Atlantic, the arrangement where one party takes the profit and another party pays the cost, would operate at a scale that Elizabeth's court, watching the Spanish treasure fleets from a distance, could not have imagined. That story begins with 5 ships and a cargo of English wool that nobody in Sumatra wanted. The first East India Company fleet left the Thames in February 1601. 5 ships, 480 men, a cargo of iron, tin, and English wool cloth. Goods the company's directors believed would find buyers in the spice ports of the East Indies. Nobody in Sumatra wanted English wool. The climate made the idea faintly absurd. But the fleet pushed on, reached Aceh on the northern tip of Sumatra after 14 months at sea, traded what it could, and came back to London in 1603 with enough pepper and spices to turn a profit of 95% on the initial investment. 95% in a single voyage. The directors reinvested, more ships, more voyages. The returns varied. Some ships sank, some crews died of disease before they cleared the Cape of Good Hope. But the average was high enough, and London's appetite for spice reliable enough that the company settled into a rhythm. A trading post at Surat on the Indian coast in 1613, then Madras, then Bombay, which came to the English crown as part of a royal dowry, and which King Charles II promptly leased to the company for £10 a year because he needed the cash, and the company was the only institution capable of doing anything useful with it. £10 a year for Bombay. This is how the empire's second great act begins, not with conquest, not with armies, with commerce. With a trading company buying low in Surat and selling high in London, its sailors dying of cholera in the Bay of Bengal, while its shareholders in London collected their dividends and examined the next voyage's projected returns. The mechanism Elizabeth had built with Drake, you take the risk, I take the reward, the costs land somewhere the ledger does not look, was now a corporation. Formalized, institutionalized, running on schedule. For the first century and a half, it worked because it did not need to be anything more than commerce. There was a functioning political order in India, vast, complex, ancient, and the company existed at its edges, buying and selling on terms the local rulers set. It was, in the most literal sense, a guest. What changed everything was not a decision made in London. It was the slow collapse of the thing the company had been trading inside. The Mughal Empire at its height was one of the great political structures of the early modern world. At its peak, it governed most of the Indian subcontinent, a territory of perhaps 150 million people, generating revenues that dwarfed those of any European state. The emperors built in marble. They maintained armies of hundreds of thousands. The tax system reached into every village and returned wealth to the center with a consistency that European monarchs, still arguing with their parliaments over every appropriation, could only watch with a kind of bewildered envy. But empires are not permanent. They are held together by specific people making specific decisions, and when those people are gone, the structures they built begin to loosen at the joints. Aurangzeb, who ruled until 1707, spent the last 26 years of his reign fighting wars in the south that drained the treasury and kept the army perpetually deployed far from the capital. He also broke the political settlement his predecessors had carefully maintained, the arrangement that had held a subcontinent of competing religions and ethnic identities together under a single administration. He imposed taxes on non-Muslims that his grandfather Akbar had abolished. He destroyed temples. The resentments he created did not die with him. When Aurangzeb died, the empire he left was vast and increasingly hollow. Provincial governors, the Nawabs and Nizams, began making independent decisions, raising their own armies, negotiating their own arrangements with whoever was willing to deal. The Maratha Confederacy pushed north. The Persians invaded in 1739 and sacked Delhi, carrying off the peacock throne. The Afghan ruler Ahmad Shah Durrani invaded repeatedly through the 1750s, each invasion stripping another layer from what remained. By 1750, the Mughal emperor was still nominally the ruler of India. In practice, he controlled the city around him and very little else. The subcontinent had become a collection of competing regional powers, strong individually, but locked in constant competition with each other in ways that made them, one by one, vulnerable to a specific kind of outside pressure. The kind that a well-capitalized, well-armed trading company was perfectly positioned to apply. The company was watching all of this from its trading posts on the coast, and in its ledgers, in the minds of the men who ran it. The fragmentation of the Mughal Empire registered not as tragedy, but as possibility. A unified subcontinent with a functioning central government sets the terms of trade. A fragmented one negotiates. Those are not the same thing, not even close. What the company needed to convert that possibility into reality was a particular kind of man, not a merchant, not a diplomat. Someone who could look at a fracturing political order and see very quickly which cracks to push on and how hard. In 1744, that man stepped off a ship in Madras. He was 18 years old. His name was Robert Clive. He had been sent to India because no one in England knew what else to do with him. He had been, by all accounts, a difficult child. Born in Shropshire in 1725, the son of a minor country lawyer with more children than income, he was sent away to relatives young and moved between schools, none of which held him for long. He fought. He organized gangs. He climbed the gargoyles of the local church steeple while the townspeople watched from below, unsure whether they were more frightened for him or of him. His father eventually secured him a company appointment as a writer, the lowest clerical grade, not because Robert had shown any aptitude for commerce, but because it removed him from Shropshire. He attempted suicide twice in Madras. This is in the record, noted by contemporaries with the detachment of men who had seen enough of India's effect on young Englishmen to find it unremarkable. The work was clerical, the climate was brutal. The death rate among company employees from dysentery, cholera, and malaria was high enough that a new arrival calculating his odds would not have felt optimistic. Clive pulled a pistol on himself on 2 separate occasions. On both occasions, it misfired. He concluded from this that he was meant for something. What he was meant for announced itself in 1746, when a French fleet attacked Madras and the company's post fell. Clive was taken prisoner. He escaped, and in the scramble through unfamiliar territory with French soldiers behind him, something shifted. He was not frightened in the way he had expected. He was, by his own later account, more alive than he had ever been behind a clerk's desk. The company gave him a military commission. Over the next decade, he demonstrated repeatedly that pressure clarified him in ways peace could not. He was quick, decisive, able to read terrain and human motivations simultaneously. He was also willing to use methods that more cautious men would not touch. In an enterprise built on the logic of privatized profit and externalized cost, that willingness was not a liability. It was a qualification. By 1757, Clive was 31 years old and the most consequential British military commander in India. He was about to demonstrate in a single afternoon exactly how the company's machine worked at full power. In June of 1757, Clive stood with an army of 3,000 men, roughly 800 British soldiers and 2,200 Indian sepoys, on the edge of a mango grove outside a village called Plassey in Bengal, facing an army of 50,000. 50,000 against 3,000. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, had cavalry, infantry, war elephants, and a French artillery contingent. He had, on paper, everything required to destroy the company force in an afternoon. Clive, by any conventional military calculation, should not have been there. The night before the battle, he wrote a letter to his fellow commanders proposing a direct assault. They voted against it. He went for a walk alone in the mango grove. This detail is in multiple contemporary accounts, the general among the trees while the army waited, and came back and overruled the vote. They would attack in the morning. Here is what the vote did not account for. The battle had already been decided, not in the grove and not by the relative sizes of the two armies. 3 months earlier, Clive had been in correspondence with Mir Jafar, the commander of a substantial portion of Siraj-ud-Dowlah's army. The correspondence was, in plain terms, a bribery negotiation. Clive offered Mir Jafar the Nawabship of Bengal, the throne, the revenues, the title, in exchange for withdrawing his forces when the battle came. Mir Jafar accepted, and the contract was signed. The outcome of a battle that had not yet been fought was already settled in a document that no historian would locate for another century. The same logic Elizabeth had used with Drake applied to a subcontinent. The Crown's letters of reprisal had given Elizabeth plausible distance from what Drake was actually doing in the Atlantic. Clive's contract with Mir Jafar gave the company plausible distance from what was, by any honest description, the purchase of a province. Someone else would fight the battle. Someone else would pay for it. The company would collect. On the 23rd of June, 1757, the battle lasted roughly 11 hours. For most of those hours, very little happened. Artillery fire across the field, advancing and retreating, two sides testing each other in the Bengal heat. Then, in the early afternoon, Mir Jafar's troops stopped advancing. They stood still. Other commanders, watching Mir Jafar and drawing their own conclusions, began to hesitate. The coordination that a large army requires, the confidence that the man beside you is doing what he is supposed to do, dissolved. Clive ordered a charge. The battle was over within the hour. Siraj-ud-Dowlah fled. He was captured 2 days later and killed, not by the company, but by Mir Jafar's son in a garden before dawn, in the way these things were handled. Mir Jafar was installed as the new Nawab of Bengal. He paid the company's army £275,000. He paid the company itself £500,000. He paid Clive personally, in cash, jewels, and land, the equivalent of somewhere between 20 and 30 million pounds today. The company had not funded the battle. Mir Jafar had funded the battle, from Bengal's treasury, which meant from Bengal's people, which meant from the same peasants and weavers and merchants whose taxes would eventually fund every subsequent company operation in India. The cost of conquering Bengal had been routed through the very population that would bear the consequences longest. Clive, years later, when asked by a parliamentary committee to account for the money, said, "I stand astonished at my own moderation." He was not joking. He had taken less than he could have. In the moral framework of the East India Company in 1757, this was restraint. What happened to Bengal after Plassey is the part of the story that tends to get skipped. The battle is remembered. What followed is not. But what followed is the point. Mir Jafar, as Nawab, existed to serve the company's commercial interests. He granted the company the right to trade throughout Bengal without paying the local duties that applied to everyone else, duties that had previously generated substantial revenue for the Nawab's treasury. He granted land. He granted access. When his revenues proved insufficient to meet the company's demands, he was replaced by his son-in-law, Mir Qasim, who offered better terms. When Mir Qasim tried to reassert some control over Bengal's commercial life and raised a small army to back the assertion, the company defeated him in battle. and brought Mir Jafar back. The Nawabs of Bengal became, from 1757 onward, a revolving door of men who served at the company's pleasure and were removed when they ceased to be useful. Then, in 1765, the Mughal emperor, the nominal sovereign of all India, by now controlling little more than his palace, granted the company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The Diwani was the right to collect taxes. In a single administrative grant, the company went from being a trading corporation operating in Bengal to being the government of Bengal, responsible for collecting revenue from 30 million people. The company responded the way a trading corporation responds to any new revenue stream. It collected the taxes. It kept the money. What it did not do, what was structurally impossible for it to do given what it was invest in Bengal at a rate that matched what it was extracting. And the Mughal administrative system, for all its faults, had returned a portion of collected revenue to the territories that generated it. Roads, irrigation, the basic maintenance of a functioning agricultural economy. The company returned nothing. It extracted. The surplus that had made Bengal the wealthiest province in the subcontinent was redirected to London, to company shareholders, to the British Treasury. Bengal's weavers, who had supplied cloth to the Mughal court and to export markets from Persia to Southeast Asia, found their livelihoods systematically destroyed. The company simultaneously controlled the market for their goods and set the prices it would pay. The prices went down. The British textile industry, protected by Parliament, had a direct interest in ensuring Indian cloth did not compete with it in European markets. And the company, which was now also the government of Bengal, ensured this with a directness that would not have been available to any entity operating at arm's length from political power. The costs of all of this, the extracted revenue, the suppressed industry, the administration optimized for extraction rather than governance, were paid by the people of Bengal. They did not appear in the company's accounts. In those accounts, Bengal was profitable. The accounts were accurate. They were also, by everything they excluded, a complete misrepresentation of what was happening on the ground. The machine was working exactly as designed. Someone else was paying. The ledger did not look at who. The full weight of that misrepresentation arrived in 1770. The monsoon failed. Across Bengal, the rice crop came in thin, then thinner, and then not at all in the eastern districts. Monsoon failures had happened before. What was new was the fiscal environment in which this one landed. The company had raised the land tax. It had raised it in years of good harvest and raised it again in the first year the harvest began to fail. Because the accounts in London showed Bengal should be generating more revenue, and the assumption built into this was that harder collection would produce it. The assumption was wrong in the way assumptions about revenue always go wrong when they are made by people who do not live in the place the revenue comes from. The peasants of Bengal, already paying more in tax than the land could comfortably support, faced a failed harvest with empty granaries. In the Mughal system, there had been mechanisms, not generous ones, not reliable ones, but mechanisms for emergency grain distribution, for tax remission in years of crisis. The company had inherited these mechanisms with the Diwani and had not maintained them, because maintaining them cost money and the accounts were already under pressure. Between 1769 and 1773, somewhere between 7 and 10 million people died in Bengal, perhaps a third of the population. Fields went unfarmed for want of people to farm them, villages emptied. The tax records from the period show, with a bureaucratic blankness that is itself a kind of horror, the declining revenues of districts where the declining revenues meant the people who had paid them were dead. The company's response was to note, in correspondence to London, that revenues had fallen and steps were being taken to restore them. Warren Hastings, who became governor of Bengal in 1772, wrote that the famine had been unfortunate. He also wrote that it had been, from a certain perspective, an opportunity. The depopulation of some districts had made land available for reassignment at better terms. In London, the shareholders received their dividends. The famine does not appear in the accounts as a cost. It appears, to the extent it appears at all, as a temporary disruption to revenue. The people who died did not hold shares. The people who held shares did not live in Bengal. 7 to 10 million people, and the machine processed them as a line item. This is the empire's operating logic, stripped of every ideology and ceremony that would later be draped over it. There was no civilizing mission in 1770. There was no rhetoric about bringing order to chaos, no language about the burden of governance, no story being told about why any of this was good for anyone. There was a trading company collecting taxes from 30 million people, optimizing for shareholder return, and a famine that killed 10 million of those people in 4 years. The accounting looked fine. It always looked fine. That was the point. Clive did not live to see the famine's full extent. He had returned to England in 1760, rich beyond any reasonable need, and spent the following years badly, buying estates, buying parliamentary seats, trying and failing to convert his Indian reputation into the kind of metropolitan standing that English society reserved for men born into it. The money was accepted, the man was tolerated. The distinction between accepted and tolerated turned out to matter. Parliament, in the early 1770s, began scrutinizing the company with the attention that powerful institutions attract when they become embarrassing. Not because of the famine, Parliament was not in the habit of holding itself responsible for the deaths of Indian peasants. The concern was that the company's corruption had become too visible to ignore. Clive was its most prominent symbol. He was called before a committee and asked to account for Plassey and the money. He explained Mir Jafar. He explained the custom of the country. He said he stood astonished at his own moderation. The committee voted that Clive had rendered great and meritorious service to his country. They also voted to condemn the practice he had demonstrated. Individual men could be condemned. The machine continued. Clive died on the 22nd of November, 1774. In his house in Berkeley Square, London. He was 49. The cause of death was recorded with the same careful vagueness the company applied to its Bengal accounts as uncertain. Contemporary accounts suggest laudanum. Whether deliberately or not, the record declines to say. No one who knew him pressed the question particularly hard. He had arrived in India at 18 with nothing and died in London with everything. And the system of extraction his victories had made possible, the puppet nawabs, the diverted revenues, the taxes raised on starving peasants, was already so embedded in the structure of British India that no one could easily say where Clive ended and the machine began. That was, in a sense, the design. The company had started as 5 ships looking for pepper. In 170 years, it had become the government of the most productive region in Asia, extracting at industrial scale, answerable to its shareholders, and through them to Parliament, and to no one else. The machine was not finished. It was just finding its scale. And the logic at its center, the logic Drake had first demonstrated in the Atlantic, that Elizabeth had first formalized in a charter, that Clive had now applied to an entire subcontinent, was about to be exported across an ocean and operated on a different population entirely. Not through a trading company this time, not through letters of reprisal or bribed generals, through something more brutal and more total than anything the company had built. The bill for that would arrive in ways that even Clive, standing astonished at his own moderation, would not have been prepared to calculate. Let's now step back and see this extraordinary economic machine and how it was used to scale the British Empire. And we're starting with someone in a strange place. Olaudah Equiano was born around 1745 in what is now southeastern Nigeria, in an Igbo community he would later describe in the book that made him famous, with the precision of a man who had spent decades holding the memory carefully. His father was an elder. The family had land, there were ceremonies, and a particular way of doing things that had not changed in living memory. He was 11 when he was kidnapped. 2 men and a woman came over the wall of the family compound while the adults were away. They grabbed Equiano and his sister. The children were gagged. Within hours they were being carried through the forest, away from everything they knew, toward a coast Equiano had never seen. He was separated from his sister somewhere along the route. The record does not contain her name. It does not say where she was taken or what happened to her. It contains, on this point, only the silence that the trade produced around every person it moved. The silence of a system that had no mechanism for recording what it cost the people inside it, only what it returned to the people who owned it. Equiano searched for her. He did not find her. He would carry that silence for the rest of his life, and it would eventually become the most powerful sentence in the most widely read abolitionist text of the 18th century. What followed, the months of overland movement, the succession of sails through African intermediaries, the first sight of the ocean, at the first sight of the ship, Equiano recorded in his autobiography with an exactness that made it impossible to look away. Not because it was the most extreme account of what the trade did to people, because Equiano was a precise observer who described what he saw without excess, and what he saw was a system operating normally. The hold, the chains, what the heat did to that many bodies over that many weeks, the crew managing the cargo, which is what the manifest called them, with the efficiency of men who had done this before and had made whatever internal adjustments the work required. He arrived in the Caribbean alive. He was sold again. He eventually came to work on a ship owned by a Quaker merchant named Robert King, and here, in a small piece of contingency that changed everything, he was permitted to trade on his own account, small goods, thin margins, whatever the ports offered. He saved, he accumulated. In 1766, after 9 years in slavery, he bought his own freedom for £40. He moved to London. He educated himself in English law and English letters. He wrote the book. He became, in the final decades of the 18th century, one of the most prominent voices in the campaign to end the trade that had carried him across the Atlantic. A man who had been cargo, in the language of a previous insurance claim, sat down and wrote the account that made the trade impossible to look away from. But the trade did not end because of Equiano alone. It did not end quickly. It did not end until the people running it had extracted everything the system could produce. To understand why, you have to understand what the system was actually built on. And it was not built on ships, and it was not built on Africa. It was built on sugar. Sugar in the 17th century was not a luxury in the way we think of luxuries now. It was closer to a necessity, a technology for preserving food, masking bitterness, making the new hot drinks arriving from the colonies palatable. Coffee, tea, chocolate were becoming daily habits for the expanding urban populations of London and Bristol. Each cup wanted sweetening. The demand was not a preference. It grew with the population, with the coffee houses, with every generation that had grown up with sugar and could not imagine food without it. Sugar grew in the Caribbean. It grew there better than almost anywhere else. The soil, the rainfall, in the climate converging in a way that made the islands uniquely suited to it. The problem was not the growing, the problem was the labor. Sugar harvesting in the 17th century was punishing in a specific, measurable way. Cut cane begins to ferment within hours, which meant that once the harvest started, it could not stop. The mills ran continuously through the cutting season. The boiling houses ran at temperatures that would register as immediately dangerous by any modern standard. The work took fingers, hands, and arms with a frequency that the plantation records noted in the same flat tone they used for everything else. The death rate among the people doing this work was high enough that the plantation population did not reproduce itself. Every year the labor force had to be replenished. The replenishment came from West Africa. Between 1640 and 1807, British ships transported approximately 3.1 million African people across the Atlantic, a ship every few days for 167 years, each ship carrying between 200 and 600 people in holds, where the average space per person was roughly the length and width of a door. The crossing took between 6 and 12 weeks. The mortality rate averaged somewhere between 10 and 20%. On bad crossings, considerably more. The people who survived were sold on the docks of Kingston and Bridgetown to plantation owners who needed labor. Prices varied with age, health, and gender, as prices do in any market. The sick were sold in bulk at reduced rates like damaged stock. This is what Exciano had been carried into, not an aberration, not the excess of a few brutal men, a system. Engineered, financed, legally protected, and returning extraordinary profits to the people at the top of it. None of whom lived anywhere near the boiling houses, none of whom appeared in the mortality figures, and none of whom were required by any instrument of British law to account for what the system cost the people who ran it from the bottom. Someone else grew the sugar. Someone else worked the mills. Someone else died in the replenishment. The ledger recorded the profit. The people in the hold were the cost. And the cost, as always, was somewhere the ledger did not look. Follow the money from the Caribbean back to Britain, and something becomes visible that the empire's later historians preferred to discuss carefully, if at all. The profits from the slave trade and the sugar plantations did not stay in the Caribbean. They came home, to Liverpool and Bristol first, whose docks and counting houses were built on Atlantic returns, whose merchant families financed the ships and collected the dividends. Then, inland, through financial networks that moved and multiplied capital in ways the previous century's system of small merchants and local banks had not been able to manage. The historians who have traced these flows, painstaking archival work following money through centuries of wills and investment ledgers and company prospectuses, have found connections that were not hidden so much as simply unexamined for a very long time. Barclays Bank was founded by Quaker families with direct connections to the trade. Lloyd's of London built its early business insuring slave ships. And many of the great country houses of England, the ones with long drives and libraries full of first editions and portraits of men in good coats looking prosperous, were built on money that had passed through the Atlantic system at some point on its way to becoming English wealth. But the most consequential destination for that money was not a country house. The Industrial Revolution required capital. It required it in quantities that the existing financial system, local banks, aristocratic landowners, small merchant networks, could not easily provide. Investment in machinery, in mill buildings, in the canals and roads that moved finished goods to market. This kind of patient, large-scale investment needed accumulated surplus. The Atlantic system had been generating accumulated surplus for a century. The connection is not simple. Economic history rarely is, but the capital was there in the banks and counting houses of Bristol and Liverpool and London, and it was there because the Atlantic trade had put it there. When the textile mills of Lancashire needed investment in the 1770s and 1780s, they found it in the same financial networks. The cotton those mills processed came from the American South, grown under conditions that would have been recognizable to anyone who had read Exciano's account of the Caribbean. The thread ran from West Africa to the Caribbean, to the port cities, to the Lancashire mills, to the expanding markets of an empire that was, by the late 18th century, producing and trading at a scale the world had not seen before. And at each point in that thread, the labor creating the value was either unpaid, coerced, or compensated at rates that made the distinction between the two difficult to identify. This is not a secret history. It is history that was simply not examined with much curiosity for a long time, partly because the people best positioned to examine it were also the people most comfortable with its conclusions. It was into this machinery, this Atlantic system of extracted labor and accumulated capital running at full industrial scale, that the Zong sailed in 1781. Luke Collingwood was not an exceptional man. The Zong was not an exceptional ship. It was one of hundreds of British vessels running the triangular trade in the 1780s, and the calculation Collingwood made, the cold arithmetic of insurance coverage versus cargo value, was the kind of calculation the trade had been producing for over a century. The logic was not his invention. He had simply inherited it, as everyone in the trade had inherited it, from a system so thoroughly rationalized at every level that the question of whether 132 people constituted cargo or murder could be processed, without apparent difficulty, as a matter of contract law. In 1783, a year after the massacre, in the middle of the public controversy it had briefly ignited, Equiano walked into Granville Sharp's office in London and handed him a detailed account of what had happened on that ship. Equiano had spent months finding the sources, tracking down the witnesses, assembling the specifics that Sharp needed to force the retrial. The man who had been separated from his sister in a forest in 1756, the man who had been carried across the Atlantic in a hold not unlike the Zong's. The man who had been listed on a manifest as cargo. He had walked into a lawyer's office with the evidence that made a different insurance claim impossible to ignore. The retrial was ordered. The owners did not collect. But no one was charged with a crime. And the trade continued for another 24 years. In 1807, the British Parliament abolished the slave trade, the transportation of enslaved people across the Atlantic. It did not abolish slavery itself. The people already enslaved on the plantations remained enslaved. The trade that had supplied them was illegal. The institution that consumed them was not. Slavery itself was abolished in 1833. The Slavery Abolition Act passed in August of that year, the product of one of the most sustained moral campaigns in British political history. Decades of Equiano's testimony and Sharp's legal battles and Wilberforce's parliamentary persistence and the petitions signed by hundreds of thousands of ordinary British people who had concluded that what the empire was doing in their name was wrong. The campaign was real. The conviction behind it was real. The people who drove it gave years of their lives to it, and some of them did not live to see the result. The government paid £20 million in compensation. It paid it to the slaveholders. The people who had been enslaved received nothing. The act included a provision for them, a period of apprenticeship during which they were required to continue working for their former owners to ease the transition for the plantation economy. The apprenticeship lasted 4 years. The £20 million was borrowed. It accrued interest as government debt for so long that British taxpayers were still servicing it in 2015. It was quietly paid off that year with no announcement. These are the facts of the 1833 Act. They sit alongside the genuine moral achievement of abolition, and they do not cancel it. But they are part of the same document. Reading only the preamble and not the financial provisions is a way of understanding abolition that leaves out a significant portion of what actually happened. The wealth the slave economy had generated, the capital that had seeded the Industrial Revolution, the port cities, the financial institutions, the country houses, remained where it had settled. It did not move. The empire had found a way to end the trade while leaving the proceeds largely undisturbed. Someone else had grown the sugar. Someone else had worked the mills. Someone else had paid the cost of 3 centuries of extracted labor. And when the accounting was finally forced into the open, when even the British Parliament could no longer look away from what the trade was, the compensation went to the people who had profited from it, not the people who had paid for it. The ledger closed. The proceeds stayed. By 1833, the empire was the largest political structure in the world. The navy that protected its trade routes was the most powerful in history. It had ended the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833, and it was, in its own telling, becoming something more than a commercial operation. It was becoming a project. Yeah, a project with a purpose, a moral direction, a reason for existing that was larger than the balance sheet. The story the empire was beginning to construct about itself, that what Britain was doing around the world was not merely profitable, but improving, that the ships and soldiers and administrators were carrying something valuable to places that did not yet have it, was about to receive its most eloquent, most influential, and most dangerous voice. A voice that would take the logic of the ledger and give it a conscience, and in doing so, make it nearly impossible to question. Now we have seen the machine. Let's see the ideology behind it, and how the empire convinced itself it was good. In the spring of 1877, the 23-year-old Oxford student sat down and wrote a document he called his Confession of Faith. It was not intended for publication. It was a private declaration, the kind of thing a serious young man writes when he is trying to organize his convictions into something he can act on. The student's name was Cecil Rhodes. He had come to Oxford late and irregularly, interrupted by years in southern Africa, where he had gone at 17 for his health, a weak chest, a family that feared tuberculosis, and where he had found something that suited him far better than convalescence. He had found diamonds. The Kimberley diamond rush of the early 1870s brought thousands of men to a dry plateau in what is now South Africa, and most of them scratched at the earth and made modest returns and went home. Rhodes stayed. He had a talent, visible almost immediately, for seeing not the individual claim but the structure of the whole operation. Who controlled the water supply, who owned the adjacent land, which claims would become worthless when the surface deposits ran out and the mining had to go deeper and require machinery that only consolidated operations could afford. While other men dug, Rhodes organized. He borrowed. He bought out neighbors at the right moment. By the time he arrived at Oxford for his intermittent studies, he was already wealthy. By the time he left, he was becoming one of the richest men in the world. The Confession of Faith was not about money. It was about something Rhodes had become convinced of with the intensity that certain kinds of minds bring to certain kinds of ideas. The unshakable, elaborated, and self-reinforcing conviction of a man who has decided he understands something important that other people have not yet grasped. His conviction was this, that the Anglo-Saxon people were the finest the world had produced, that their particular combination of qualities, the instinct for governance, the commercial energy, the legal tradition, the language, made them uniquely suited to running the world, and that running as much of it as possible was therefore not merely Britain's interest, but its duty. A duty to the territories that would be governed, a duty to the people who would be improved by the governing, a duty, ultimately, to civilization itself. He wrote that he wanted to establish a secret society, funded by his wealth, and directed by men who shared his conviction, whose purpose would be the extension of British rule across the entire globe. He wanted to paint the map red from Cape Town to Cairo, and then beyond Africa, across Asia, eventually back to the United States, which Rhodes considered a lost province of Anglo-Saxon civilization that might one day be recovered. He was 23. He was also, in the specific sense that matters here, not unusual. The idea Rhodes was articulating in his confession had been developing for decades before he put a pen to it. By 1877, it had gathered vocabulary and authority from multiple directions simultaneously, and had already become, in various more polished forms, something close to the official self-understanding of the British Empire. It had a name, the Civilising Mission. The argument ran like this. Britain had developed, through history, through the Protestant Reformation, through the Industrial Revolution, through various combinations of factors that different versions of the argument weighted differently, a set of capabilities and institutions that were objectively superior to those of other societies. Parliamentary governance, common law, industrial technology, free trade. These were not merely British preferences. They were, in this telling, the direction in which all human societies were naturally developing, and Britain had simply arrived there first. From this followed a responsibility. Societies that had not yet developed these institutions were, in the language of the era, backward. They needed assistance to reach the level Britain had already achieved, and Britain, as the society furthest along this road, it was uniquely positioned to provide that assistance. The assistance looked from the outside a great deal like conquest. It involved soldiers and gunboats. It involved the suppression of local governance structures that had been functioning for centuries. It involved the replacement of local legal systems with British ones, local languages with English, local educational traditions with curricula designed in London. It involved, in many cases, the forcible reorganization of local economies to serve the needs of British industry rather than local consumption. Inside the civilizing mission's own logic, none of this was conquest. It was development. The soldiers were maintaining order. The administrators were building institutions. The missionaries were saving souls. The whole enterprise was, in the most sincere possible telling of it, a gift. And here's the thing that makes this more than simply cynical propaganda, more than a convenient story told by powerful people to justify their power. Many of the people who believed it completely. The missionaries who walked into the African interior and spent decades learning local languages and building schools believed they were doing something genuinely valuable. The district officers who administered remote provinces of India and learned to speak the local language and arbitrate local disputes with genuine care believed they were serving something larger than themselves. The belief was real. What the belief did, functionally, was provide answers to questions that the commercial logic of the empire could not answer on its own. Why are we here? We are here to improve. Why do we stay when it is expensive and difficult? Because the work is not finished. Why do we suppress resistance? Because resistance delays the improvement that is coming. Every cost that could not be justified by the balance sheet could be justified by the mission. And since the mission was infinite, civilization always in the process of being extended, never complete, the justifications were inexhaustible. This is what made the ideology the most powerful instrument in the empire's history. The gunboats could only go where the navy could sail. The administrators could only govern where the army had already been. But the story, a story believed sincerely by the people telling it, providing moral cover for costs the balance sheet could not absorb, had no such limits. It could go anywhere. It could justify anything. And it could take the mechanism that Drake had first demonstrated in the Atlantic, that Clive had applied to Bengal, that the Atlantic trade had operated on 3.1 million people, and give it something none of those earlier iterations had possessed: a conscience. And a conscience, once attached to a machine built on making someone else pay, is the most dangerous thing that machine can acquire. Because now the machine does not merely extract, it believes it is helping. And a machine that believes it is helping cannot be stopped by pointing out the harm it causes. Because the harm, inside the machine's own logic, is always temporary. Always the cost of improvement not yet complete. Always someone else's fault for resisting. Cecil Rhodes did not stay at Oxford long enough to take a degree on his first attempt. Then he went back to Africa and spent the 1880s completing what he had started: the consolidation of the Kimberley mines into a single company, De Beers, which by 1888 controlled 90% of the world's diamond production. The mechanics of how he achieved this are worth a moment's attention, because they are a precise echo of how Clive had achieved Bengal. The Kimberley fields were worked by hundreds of independent claim holders, competing with each other, undercutting each other on price, unable to control the market because no single one of them was large enough to set terms. Rhodes understood that the value of diamonds was entirely dependent on scarcity. The diamonds, in geological terms, are not especially rare, and that the only thing standing between the current price and collapse was the management of supply. He bought. He consolidated. He squeezed competitors until they sold. By the time De Beers was formally established, the market for diamonds was not a market in any conventional sense. It was a controlled distribution system, and Rhodes controlled it. The same logic Clive had used with the Nawabs of Bengal: install the right man, control the terms, extract the surplus, applied to a commodity market on a different continent a century later. The mechanism traveled. It always traveled. Rhodes then turned his attention north. The territory that would become Rhodesia, present-day Zimbabwe and Zambia, was acquired in 1888 through a concession agreement with Lobengula, the king of the Ndebele people. The agreement, as Lobengula understood it, gave a Rhodes-backed company the right to dig for minerals in a defined area of his territory. As the company's lawyers had written it, it gave the company effectively unlimited rights to govern and police the territory and bring in settlers. Lobengula, who did not read English, signed it. When he understood what he had signed, he wrote to Queen Victoria. His letter, formal and precise, asked her to investigate whether the agreement his people had understood and the agreement the company claimed were the same document. Victoria's government replied that the concession was valid. Lobengula eventually went to war. He lost. He fled north in 1893 and died in the bush of smallpox the following year. Rhodes held, simultaneously, the chairmanship of De Beers, the chairmanship of the British South Africa Company that governed Rhodesia, and the premiership of the Cape Colony. He was a private citizen, a corporate executive, and a colonial governor, and the lines between these roles were, in practice, non-existent. The commercial interest, the political interest, and the imperial interest had been folded into a single person, operating under the ideological cover of a civilizing mission that he genuinely believed in and that genuinely served his balance sheet. When asked in a moment of unusual directness what he thought philanthropy was, Rhodes said, "Philanthropy plus 5%. The 5% matters. It matters because the civilizing mission was not a mask worn over purely commercial motives, easily removed when convenient. It was something more tangled, a genuine belief that had grown up around and through commercial interests until the two were no longer separable, even to the people holding them." Rhodes did not experience his conviction and his balance sheet as contradictions. He experienced them as the same thing, because in his own internal architecture, they were. Someone else was paying, but now the man collecting the bill believed he was doing the payer a favor. The Victorian era gave the civilizing mission its most widely read expression in 1899, when Rudyard Kipling published a poem called The White Man's Burden. It was written for an American audience. The United States had just acquired the Philippines from Spain and was wrestling with what to do with an overseas territory whose inhabitants had not been consulted about the acquisition. Kipling's message was direct. This is what empire requires of you. The work is hard. The people you govern will not thank you. But it is your duty. Why? Because of what you are and what they are not yet. The poem was criticized on both sides of the Atlantic. Mark Twain wrote a mordant response. Anti-imperialists identified it as the ideology it was, but it was also reproduced widely, recited in schools, quoted in parliamentary debates. It gave the ideology a form that was easy to transmit and easy to remember. What the poem described, the unrewarded, thankless labor of civilizing people who did not appreciate it, was a remarkably effective inversion of what the empire was actually doing. In Kipling's framing, the imperial power is the one making the sacrifice, the effort, the expense, the ingratitude endured. These are the empire's costs, borne nobly. The people being governed are the ones receiving the benefit. The accounting had been reversed, and the people paying the bill had been recast as the ones cashing the check. This is the ideological mechanism at its most refined. Drake's letters of reprisal had concealed what was happening in the Atlantic. The East India Company's charter had concealed what was happening in Bengal. The compensation paid to slaveholders rather than the enslaved had concealed what abolition actually cost and who paid for it. Each of these was a specific instrument of concealment applied to a specific transaction. The civilizing mission was something larger. It was a concealment applied to the entire enterprise, a story so total, so thoroughly embedded in the schools and churches and newspapers and adventure novels of Victorian Britain that it did not need to be enforced. It reproduced itself. Boys grew up reading stories about district officers bringing justice to grateful natives and genuinely wanted, to become those men. They went to India and Africa and the Caribbean and administered the territories and believed, with complete sincerity, that what they were doing was good, that the resistance they encountered was ignorance, that the costs being paid by the people around them were the temporary price of permanent improvement. The machine had given itself a story, and the story was believed by the machine's own operators. Rhodes died in 1902 at 48 of heart failure in a small cottage near Cape Town. He was buried at his own instruction on a hilltop in the Matobo Hills of Rhodesia, in a grave blasted from the rock. He had asked to be buried there because he had stood on that hill once and felt, he said, that he was at the top of the world. His will endowed the scholarships that still bear his name, the Rhodes Scholarships at Oxford, designed explicitly to recruit and form the kind of men who would extend British influence across the world. The scholarships have outlasted the empire they were meant to serve. They are awarded today without reference to the racial theories that structured the original endowment. He also left behind, in southern Africa, a set of conditions: the dispossession of the Ndebele and Shona peoples, the land settlement patterns of colonial Zimbabwe, the racial political economy of what would become apartheid South Africa, that outlasted him by a century and in some cases structure the present. This is the civilizing mission's specific legacy, not the intentions of the people who believed in it, which were often genuine, the gap between those intentions and the conditions they created. The gap is measurable. It sits in land registries and constitutional histories and the demographic distribution of wealth across the countries the mission passed through. The people who drove the civilizing mission were not, in the main, hypocrites. They believed what they said. The problem was not that the ideology was insincere. The problem was that it was wrong, and that its wrongness was structured in a way that made it nearly impossible to recognize from the inside, because the ideology itself provided the framework through which its own consequences were interpreted. When the people of Rhodesia resisted, the resistance was evidence of how far they still had to go. When the land concession produced dispossession rather than development, it was evidence of the difficulty of the work. When the empire's costs continued to land on the people it was supposedly improving, the ideology provided the answer. In time, with patience, the improvement would come. It was an explanation that could absorb any evidence. That is what made it so durable. And that is what made it, in the long run, the most expensive story the empire ever told. Because the bill for believing it would arrive not in one place and not at one moment, but slowly, across the second half of the 20th century, in the form of every fragile state and every contested border and every political crisis in every country where the mission had passed through and left its particular kind of order behind. But before that bill arrived, the empire had to discover something its commercial logic had always suspected and its ideology had always denied. The people it governed had a point of view, and some of them were about to make it violently clear. The cracks that will bring down the whole thing began to appear. On the 29th of March, 1857, a soldier named Mangal Pandey walked onto the parade ground of the 34th Bengal Native Infantry at Barrackpore, outside Calcutta, in a state his commanding officers would later describe in their reports as agitated. He was carrying a loaded musket. Pandey was a sepoy, an Indian soldier serving in the East India Company's army. He was 26 years old, from a high-caste Brahmin family in what is now Uttar Pradesh, and he had served the company for 7 years without particular incident. And his service record was unremarkable in the way that the records of men who do their work quietly tend to be unremarkable. Nothing in it suggests that anyone had been paying particular attention to him. On that March morning, he shot and wounded 2 British officers. He tried to shoot a third. When his fellow sepoys were ordered to restrain him, most of them stood still. One man moved to help the wounded officers. The rest watched. Pandey was arrested, court-martialed, and hanged on the 8th of April. The regiment that had stood still while he attacked British officers was disbanded in disgrace. Their commander, who had also hesitated, was dismissed. The British administration recorded the incident as the act of a disturbed individual and moved on. They were wrong about that. What had happened at Barrackpore on the 29th of March was not the act of a disturbed individual. It was the first audible crack in a structure that had been developing fractures for years. And what came next, in the months that followed, would shake the British Empire more profoundly than anything since the loss of America. To understand what Mangal Pandey was reacting to, you have to understand what the company's army actually was by 1857. The Bengal Army, one of 3 presidency armies the company maintained in India, comprised roughly 150,000 Indian soldiers and perhaps 40,000 British ones. The ratio was not unusual. The entire British administrative and military presence in India at a moment when the company nominally governed a territory of 200 million people is amounted to perhaps 100,000 British individuals in total. Civil servants, soldiers, merchants, clergy, the entire apparatus of British India, laid across a subcontinent, was outnumbered by the people it governed at a ratio of roughly 2,000 to 1. This ratio was not a secret. The men who ran British India knew it, wrote about it in their private correspondence, and built their entire administrative strategy around a single operational requirement: the consent, or at least the passivity, of the governed. Not loyalty necessarily, not affection, simply the absence of organized, coordinated resistance. The empire in India did not hold by force alone. It could not have. It held because the 200 million people it governed had not, at any given moment, and organized themselves into a unified opposition because they were divided by language, religion, caste, regional loyalty, and the carefully maintained rivalries that British administration had learned over a century to cultivate rather than resolve. Lord Elphinstone, the governor of Bombay, wrote privately in the 1850s that the British position in India rested on the division of the natives amongst themselves. He was not describing a strategy he was proposing. He was describing the strategy already in operation. The foundation on which the empire stood was not the army. It was not the administration. It was the absence of unity among the people being governed. A foundation, in other words, that the empire did not build and could not control. A foundation that could shift without warning, without declaration, yes, without any of the signals that a military or political intelligence apparatus was designed to detect. In the spring of 1857, something happened that threatened to supply the unity the empire had spent decades preventing. And it started, of all places, with a cartridge. The Enfield rifle had been introduced into the company's Indian armies in late 1856. It was a significant improvement over the muskets the sepoys had been using, more accurate, more reliable. The cartridges it used were a new design, a paper case containing powder and ball sealed at one end with a greased compound to protect it from moisture. To load the rifle, a soldier had to bite off the sealed end of the cartridge. Rumors moved through the sepoy regiments in early 1857, impossible now to trace to their origin, so spreading through barracks and villages that supplied the army with recruits, that the grease used to seal the cartridges was a mixture of pig fat and beef tallow. Pig fat was forbidden to Muslims, beef tallow was forbidden to Hindus. The Enfield cartridge, if the rumors were true, required every sepoy to choose between his religion and his rifle. The company's officers, when the rumors reached them, responded in ways that ranged from dismissive to counterproductive. Some held public demonstrations, breaking open cartridges to show the contents. Others issued new cartridges and told the men they could grease them with whatever substance they preferred. The gestures were too late and too small. The rumor had acquired a meaning that went beyond the cartridge itself, because the cartridge was not really about the cartridge. Now, it was about a decade of accumulating grievances, the annexations of Indian kingdoms under the doctrine of lapse, a company policy that absorbed any princely state whose ruler died without a direct male heir, regardless of the adopted heirs that Indian succession law had always recognized. It was about the displacement of the Persian-speaking administrative class that had served the Mughal system and found itself progressively irrelevant under British administration. It was about the missionary activity that had intensified through the 1840s and 1850s, with British officers increasingly open about their belief that India's religions were inferior and their hope that Christianity would eventually replace them. It was about 100 daily indignities administered by men who had absorbed the ideology of civilization so thoroughly that they had ceased to notice the effect of their assumptions on the people around them. The cartridge gave all of this a single, concrete, communicable form. It said, in the language of the body, rather than the language of politics, they want you to defile yourself. They want to take from you the thing you cannot give. This is what they think of you. The uprising that began in May 1857 spread across northern and central India with a speed that alarmed British commanders precisely because it demonstrated the thing they had spent decades trying to prevent: coordination. Sepoy regiments at Meerut shot their British officers and marched to Delhi, as were they declared the aging Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar the leader of a restored Indian sovereignty. The emperor was 82 years old, had not governed in any real sense for decades, and was by most contemporary accounts a gentle and scholarly man who wrote poetry and had not asked for this role. But the symbolism was not accidental. Delhi was the Mughal capital. The Mughal emperor was the one figure who could plausibly represent an Indian authority prior to and independent of the company. The sepoys who marched to Delhi were not simply mutinying. They were reaching for a different political order. The uprising spread to Kanpur, where a British garrison surrendered under a promise of safe passage that was then broken. The British soldiers and a large number of British women and children were killed. It spread to Lucknow, where the British residency was besieged for 5 months. It spread to Jhansi, where the Queen, Lakshmi Bai, whose kingdom had been absorbed under the doctrine of lapse, took command of the resistance herself and died fighting in June 1858. It did not spread everywhere. Large parts of India remained quiet. The Sikh kingdoms of the Punjab, defeated by the company less than a decade earlier, did not rise, partly because Sikh soldiers had their own grievances with the Mughal tradition the Delhi sepoys were invoking, partly because the British had been careful to maintain better relationships with Punjabi rulers than with others. The princely states treated reasonably also remained loyal, or at least neutral. The pattern of who rose and who did not was itself a map of the empire's operating logic. The places that rose were the places where the company's behavior had been most nakedly extractive, most disruptive of existing arrangements, most contemptuous of local institutions. The places that stayed quiet were the places where the company had been more careful, where it had maintained the forms of local governance even while controlling the substance. The uprising was, among other things, a receipt. A record of everywhere the bill had been presented most aggressively and everyone who had finally decided they would no longer pay it. The British response was overwhelming and, in its early phases, indiscriminate. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned. Prisoners were executed without trial. Some were strapped across the mouths of cannons, a form of execution the British called blowing from a gun. He had chosen partly because it was spectacular, and partly because it prevented the Hindu religious rites that required an intact body. The deliberateness of that choice, the selection of a method of execution specifically designed to violate the religious sensibilities of the people being executed, was noted in the Indian accounts of the uprising and largely absent from the British ones. Delhi was retaken in September 1857. Bahadur Shah Zafar was captured, tried for treason, and exiled to Rangoon, where he died in 1862. His sons were shot. The last Mughal emperor spent his final years writing poetry in a Burmese prison, asking to be buried in Delhi, a request that was denied. He was buried in Rangoon in an unmarked grave, so that his tomb would not become a place of pilgrimage. By mid-1858, the uprising had been suppressed. The British government made the one institutional decision the uprising had made unavoidable. It abolished the East India Company, the corporation that had started with 5 ships looking for pepper, that had bribed its way to the Diwani of Bengal, that had governed a subcontinent for nearly a century through a combination of military force, financial leverage, and the strategic cultivation of division, was dissolved by Act of Parliament on the 2nd of August, 1858. Its armies became the armies of the Crown. Its territories became the territories of the Crown. Its civil servants became servants of the Crown. Queen Victoria assumed the title Empress of India in 1876. The logic had not changed. It had simply moved upstairs, but something had shifted in the understanding of the people running the empire, and even if it had not shifted in the empire's operations. The 1857 uprising had demonstrated, with a violence that no administrative report could paper over, that the foundation the empire stood on, the passivity of the governed, was not a permanent condition. It was a variable. It depended on things. It could change. The men who came to govern India after 1858 governed with an awareness that was different from the breezy confidence of the pre-mutiny era. They knew the ratio. They understood, in the way a man understands something only after he has been frightened by it, that the entire system rested on something other than force, and that something could be withdrawn. What followed was a more deliberate construction of distance. The racial separation that had been casual before became formal. The social mixing that had characterized the earlier company era, the British officers who learned Indian languages, took Indian wives, participated in local religious ceremonies, was replaced by a more rigid segregation. The hill stations, the clubs, the administrative culture of the late Victorian Raj were all, in part, responses to 1857. A British community in India that was more enclosed, more self-referential, more insulated from the people it governed, precisely because the people it governed had demonstrated that proximity carried risk. The ideology of civilization hardened. Before 1857, it had been a justification for what the empire was doing. After 1857, it also became a psychological barrier, a way of maintaining the distance that the numbers required. If the people you governed were essentially different from you, not yet developed, not yet ready for self-governance, in need of tutelage that only you could provide, then their resentment of your governance was not a signal that your governance was unjust. It was evidence of how far they still had to go. This interpretation was genuinely believed. It was also, at every level of the Indian administration, a way of not having to think too carefully about the ratio. There is a letter, written in 1878 by a senior Indian civil service officer, that captures something the official records tend to obscure. He wrote privately to a colleague in London, "We govern this country on the assumption that it consents to be governed. The moment that assumption fails, we have nothing. The army is too small, the administration is too thin. What we have is a fiction maintained by the willingness of 300 million people to treat it as a fact. I am not certain how long that willingness will last, and I am reasonably certain that the men in London do not ask themselves the question." The men in London were not asking the question. They were looking at the red map, spreading wider every decade, and drawing the conclusion that spread implied strength. But the letter was accurate about the foundation. The empire was not held by force. It was held by the daily, renewable decision of hundreds of millions of people not to organize against it. A decision that rested on 100 different calculations, some about force, some about economic interest, some about the genuinely functional aspects of British administration, and some about the sheer difficulty of coordinating resistance across a subcontinent divided by language and religion and political history. Those calculations were not fixed. They changed as conditions changed. And the conditions were, slowly and then less slowly, changing. A young lawyer had arrived in South Africa from London in 1893, having failed to establish a legal practice in India. He had boarded a first-class train carriage in Pietermaritzburg, a carriage he had a legal ticket for, in a country governed by the same empire whose passport he carried and whose laws he had studied. A railway official told him to move to the third-class carriage. He refused. He was thrown off the train. He sat on the platform through the cold night with his luggage beside him, in a country that was technically part of the same political structure he had grown up inside, and something in that night shifted. His name was Mohandas Gandhi. He was 23 years old. What shifted was not simply anger. Anger was available to anyone who had been thrown off a train. What shifted was something more precise, a recognition of the gap between what the empire claimed to be and what it actually was. The law he had studied, the passport he carried, the empire he had been raised to respect. None of it applied to him in the way he had understood it to apply, and the gap between the claim and the reality was not an accident, not an oversight, not a local aberration that London would correct if properly informed. It was the system, operating normally. He spent the next 21 years in South Africa developing, in the specific laboratory of its racial laws, a method of political resistance that did not fit the categories the British administration was trained to manage. He called it satyagraha, truth force. It meant the deliberate, disciplined refusal to cooperate with an unjust system, not through violence, which the system was better equipped to handle than any resistance movement, but through the withdrawal of the compliance that the system required to function. Recall the letter from 1878. We govern this country on the assumption that it consents to be governed. The moment that assumption fails, we have nothing. Gandhi had spent 21 years developing the instrument that would make the assumption fail. He returned to India in January 1915. He was 45 years old. He arrived not in the suit of an educated Indian lawyer, which the British officials who met him expected, but in the simple cotton dhoti of a poor man, which they had not. The British administration understood fairly quickly that Gandhi was different from the political opponents it had handled before. He was not demanding a seat at the table. He was questioning the table. He was asking the question the empire had never been required to answer honestly. On what basis exactly are you here? The administration's answer, the civilizing mission, the rule of law, the benefits of British governance, had been formidable when unquestioned. Questioned directly, repeatedly, by a man whose personal conduct embodied a moral seriousness that made him difficult to dismiss, it began to sound like what it had always been, a justification constructed after the fact by people who needed one. And the machine had a conscience now. But the conscience had an adversary who understood exactly how it worked. The bill was not presented yet. The empire would reach its greatest territorial extent in 1920. The red map at its widest, the fiction still functioning, the assumption still holding. But the question had been asked, and questions, once asked with sufficient clarity and sufficient courage, do not go away simply because the people in power decline to answer them. The answer was coming. It would arrive not from a parade ground in Bengal, not from a mango grove in Plassey, not from a contract signed in secret before a battle whose outcome was already settled. It would arrive from the direction no empire ever watches closely enough, from its own balance sheet. 2 world wars and the end of the balance sheet. On the 28th of June, 1914, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip stepped out of a delicatessen in Sarajevo and shot the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary twice at close range. The Archduke died within the hour. His wife died shortly after. The assassination was not in itself the kind of event that ends empires. Franz Ferdinand was not a man whose death would, under ordinary circumstances, have reordered the world. He was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, significant within the particular hierarchies of European royalty, but not a figure whose removal should have mattered to a farmer in Bengal or a factory worker in Lancashire, or a soldier in Lagos. What the assassination did was pull a thread, and the thread, it turned out, was load-bearing. The European alliance system of 1914 had been constructed over 4 decades of careful diplomatic engineering. A network of mutual defense treaties, military obligations, and mobilization schedules, so interlocking and so rigid that once any part of it was activated, the rest followed almost automatically. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized in support of Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia and France. Germany invaded Belgium to reach France. Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. In 6 weeks, the assassination of a single man in a Sarajevo street had activated the entire mechanism. Britain entered the First World War in August 1914 as the dominant world power. It had the largest navy in history. It controlled a quarter of the Earth's surface. The war, its politicians told the public, would be over by Christmas. It lasted 4 years and 3 months. Britain spent £11 billion fighting the First World War. This was roughly 10 times the annual government budget of 1913. The Treasury borrowed and spent at a rate that would have been inconceivable to anyone who had managed British public finances in the previous century. At the start of the war, Britain was the world's largest creditor nation, the country to which more money was owed by more countries than any other on earth. By the end of the war, Britain was a debtor. The primary creditor was the United States, which had spent the war years lending to both sides and had accumulated the world's gold reserves while Europe burned through its own. The shift took 4 years. Reversing it would take decades. And in important respects, it was never reversed. The physical costs were different in kind, but equal in weight. Britain lost 700,000 men dead, a number that, stated plainly, does not convey what it meant to the specific towns and villages and social classes from which those men had come. The PALS battalions, units recruited from the same street, the same workplace, the same town, so that men would serve alongside people they knew, meant that when a battalion was destroyed in an afternoon at the Somme, the destruction was geographically concentrated. There were villages in northern England that lost most of their young men in a single day. The social fabric of those places did not recover in the lifetimes of the people who had lived through it. The officers, the men from the public schools and universities who had been raised from birth to administer the empire, who had absorbed the ideology of civilization as a personal calling, who provided the human infrastructure of British India and the colonial service and the diplomatic corps, died at higher rates than their men because the tactical doctrine of 1914 required officers to lead from the front. The generation that should have administered the empire through the 1920s and 1930s had been significantly thinned in the mud of Flanders. Britain emerged from 1918 technically victorious and practically broken. The Versailles settlement gave it more territory. The former German colonies, the former Ottoman territories in the Middle East, the mandate system that allowed the League of Nations to present British and French occupation of Arab lands as temporary administration rather than permanent conquest. The map got redder. The resources to hold the map did not grow to match it. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the histories of empires approaching their end. The acquisition of territory continues past the point at which the acquirer can afford it, because the logic of expansion has its own momentum, and because stopping requires an admission of limitation that powerful states find psychologically difficult. The red map of 1920 was the British Empire at its greatest territorial extent. It was also the British Empire at the beginning of its terminal phase, though almost no one in London was prepared to say so. The war had done something else, less visible than the balance sheet, equally consequential. It had made promises. In 1917, with the war going badly on the Western Front and Russia knocked out of the fight by revolution, The British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter to Lord Walter Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, stating that Britain viewed with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Palestine was at the time part of the Ottoman Empire and had already been promised in earlier negotiations to the Arab leaders who had revolted against the Ottomans in exchange for British support. The same territory had now been committed to two different peoples, for two different reasons, in two different diplomatic channels, by the same government. Britain would spend the next 30 years attempting to manage the consequences of this. It would not succeed. In Egypt, in Ireland, in India, similar dynamics were running. Populations that had contributed to the war effort, Irish soldiers on the Western Front, Egyptian laborers pressed into service, Indian troops who had fought in every theater of the war, returned home or heard from those who returned and measured what they had given against what they had been promised. The promises varied. Some had been explicit. Indian political leaders had been told that wartime cooperation would be rewarded with expanded self-governance. Some had been implicit. The rhetoric of the war, a war for the freedom of small nations, a war against imperial aggression, a war to make the world safe for democracy, carried a logic that did not stop at the borders of the British Empire. If the war was about the right of nations to determine their own futures, what did that mean for India? For Egypt? For Ireland? For the Caribbean populations that had sent men to die in a European war and returned to find their political status unchanged? The British government's answer was reforms large enough to seem significant and small enough to change nothing fundamental. The Government of India Act of 1919 expanded Indian participation in provincial governance while retaining British control of the central government, the army, and foreign policy. It satisfied almost nobody. Gandhi, and who had returned to India 4 years earlier and had been building the instrument of non-cooperation with the patience of a man who understood exactly what he was constructing, watched the act pass and said nothing in public that he had not already said. He did not need to revise his assessment. The act had confirmed it. In April 1919, 6 weeks after the passage of legislation extending wartime emergency powers into the peace, which Indians widely read as evidence that the wartime promises of expanded self-governance were not going to be honored, a crowd gathered in a walled garden in Amritsar called Jallianwala Bagh. The crowd was large. Estimates vary between 10,000 and 20,000 people. They had come for a public meeting on a day that was also a religious festival. Many were not aware that public gatherings had been prohibited under the emergency powers. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer arrived with 90 soldiers and 2 armored vehicles. The armored vehicles could not fit through the narrow entrance to the garden. Dyer entered with the soldiers. Without warning, without any order to disperse, he commanded his men to fire into the crowd. They fired for 10 minutes. When the ammunition ran low, Dyer ordered his men to aim specifically at the places where the crowd was densest and the exits were blocked. The official British death toll was 379. Indian estimates, based on the number of families who reported missing members in the days that followed, put the figure significantly higher, between 500 and 600 dead, with over 1,000 wounded. Dyer returned to his headquarters and wrote in his report that he had taught the crowd a lesson. He said he had not stopped firing when the crowd began to run because he wanted to produce a sufficient moral effect. He had considered using his armored vehicles if they had been able to enter, and had only refrained because the entrance was too narrow. The Hunter Commission, appointed to investigate, concluded that Dyer had acted wrongly. The House of Lords passed a motion supporting him. The Morning Post opened a public subscription for Dyer that raised the equivalent of several £100,000. He retired with a pension and spent his remaining years in England, giving occasional interviews in which he expressed no regret. In India, the massacre did what Dyer had intended it not to do. It unified. The moderate Indians who had been willing to work within the constitutional framework the British offered, looked at Jallianwala Bagh, and revised their assessment of what that framework was actually built on. Jawaharlal Nehru, who would become India's first prime minister, wrote that the massacre had changed something permanent in his understanding of the British presence in India. He had known, intellectually, what the empire was. Amritsar made him feel it. Gandhi called the post-war legislation satanic. It was the strongest language he had used about the empire to that point. He would use stronger later. The Second World War began 20 years after the first ended. Britain entered it in September 1939 with a balance sheet that had not recovered from 1918, an army that had been systematically underfunded through the interwar years, and an empire already straining at its seams. Ireland had left in 1922. Egypt was in permanent nationalist agitation. India was being held with increasing difficulty against a non-cooperation movement that had made the cost of governance visibly higher every year. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940. At the moment the war was going most badly. France had fallen, the army had been evacuated from Dunkirk, and the island faced, for the first time since Napoleon, the genuine possibility of invasion. Churchill was the right man for that moment in the specific and limited sense that he had the capacity to make the British public believe, against the available evidence, that the situation was survivable. His speeches were the ideology of empire applied to a domestic audience. The greatness of Britain, the duty of resistance, at the civilizational stakes of the conflict. They worked. They worked because the situation was genuinely desperate, and desperate situations respond to a particular kind of voice. Churchill was also a Victorian imperialist of the most unreconstructed kind. A man who had ridden in the last cavalry charge in British military history at Omdurman in 1898, who had spent his early career absorbing the ideology of civilization in its purest form, and had never seriously updated his understanding of what the empire was or what it owed to the people it governed. In 1942, with the Japanese advancing through Southeast Asia and threatening India from the east, Churchill made the promise that could not be unmade. India would receive full independence after the war in exchange for cooperation during it. The offer was conditional and hedged and ultimately rejected by Congress as insufficient. But the logic was irreversible. Britain needed India more than India needed Britain in 1942. Everyone involved knew it. The relationship had shifted, and the shift could not be unshifted. In Bengal, in 1943, between 2 and 3 million people died of famine. The causes were multiple. A cyclone that damaged the rice crop, wartime restrictions on boat transport that disrupted distribution networks, the dislocation of the war economy, local administrative failures. But layered over all of these was a set of decisions made in London that made the difference between a food shortage and a catastrophe. Churchill's war cabinet had diverted food supplies away from Bengal, prioritizing the provisioning of British and Allied troops, the stockpiling grain in Britain and the Mediterranean, continuing to export rice from India even as the famine developed. Requests from the Indian government for emergency food imports were delayed and reduced. The official position was that the ships could not be spared. The Viceroy of India wrote to Churchill in September 1943 that the famine was the worst in Bengal since 1770. Churchill's response, recorded in the minutes of the War Cabinet, was to ask why Gandhi had not died yet. He also wrote in a telegram to the Secretary of State for India that the famine was the fault of Indians themselves for breeding like rabbits. The people making these decisions were not indifferent to death in general. They were presiding over a war in which British soldiers were dying in large numbers, and those deaths mattered to them personally and politically. The Bengal famine did not register in the same way. The people dying were not in the column of the ledger that the decision-makers were required to read. 173 years after the Bengal famine of 1770. The same province, the same dynamic. Decisions made by people in London, optimizing for priorities that did not include Bengali lives, producing a catastrophe that those same people then declined to examine too closely. The company had extracted Bengal's surplus and called it governance. Churchill's war cabinet diverted Bengal's food and called it wartime necessity. The machine had changed its name several times between 1770 and 1943. Or it had gone from the East India Company to the Crown to the British Indian Empire to a wartime coalition government. The ideology had shifted, the personnel had changed, the administrative structures had been reorganized more than once. But the basic operating logic, the Bengal question, was about resources, and the resources were needed elsewhere, and the people dying were in a column the decision-makers were not required to read, had survived every reorganization intact. Someone else paid. They always did. The ledger always found a way to look somewhere else. Britain emerged from the Second World War victorious, and for the second time in 30 years, financially destroyed. The debt to America was now larger than after the First World War. The military was exhausted. The domestic population, at which had endured 6 years of rationing and bombing and loss, wanted schools and hospitals and houses, not the continued expense of garrisoning an empire that was increasingly costly to hold and increasingly resistant to being held. The Labour government elected in 1945, in a landslide that removed Churchill from office before the war in the Pacific had even ended, which was itself a signal about what the British public now considered important, looked at the balance sheet and drew the conclusion the balance sheet demanded. India would go. The question was no longer whether. It was how. The how, it turned out, would matter more than anyone in London was prepared to account for. The answer they arrived at, rushed, under-resourced, yet delegated to a single man with almost no preparation and no knowledge of the territory he was being asked to divide, would produce, in 6 weeks in the summer of 1947, a human catastrophe of a scale the empire would never be required to formally answer for. That catastrophe is where the bill finally arrived, in full, paid, as always, by someone else. We have seen it all now, the emperor, the machine, the ideology, and everything in between. Let's close this video with what the empire left behind and what it took. In June 1947, a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe stepped off a plane in Delhi for the first time in his life. He had been sent to draw a line. Radcliffe was a distinguished man by the measures that distinguished men were measured by in post-war Britain. A King's Counsel, a former director of the wartime press, a man of considerable administrative competence. He had been chosen for the task precisely because he had no prior connection to India, no existing relationships, no accumulated loyalties, no history with the subcontinent that might compromise his judgment. He was, in the language of the appointment, a neutral party. What he had never done was visit India. He had not walked its roads or eaten its food or spoken with the people who had lived for centuries on the land he was about to divide. He did not speak any of its languages. He arrived in June, was given 5 weeks to complete his work, and left in August without waiting to see the result. His task was to draw the borders of the 2 new nations that would replace British India on the 14th and 15th of August, 1947, India and Pakistan. The borders would run through Punjab in the northwest and Bengal in the east, cutting through provinces that had, over centuries, developed dense patterns of coexistence, Hindu and Muslim villages interleaved, farms that crossed the lines Radcliffe was drawing, families whose members would wake up on different sides of a border that had not existed when they went to sleep. The Radcliffe Line was published on the 17th of August, 2 days after independence. 2 days after the flags had already been raised and the speeches already made. The people most affected by the line learned where it fell after the political ceremony was complete. In some places, the line ran through the middle of a village. In at least one documented case, it ran through the middle of a house. What followed has no clean name in English. Partition. The word is administrative, almost technical, and it does not carry what actually happened. In the 6 weeks after independence, somewhere between 1 and 2 million people died. Hindus and Sikhs moving east, Muslims moving west, columns of refugees stretching for miles on roads that had never been built to carry that volume of movement, encountering columns moving in the opposite direction. And in the violence that erupted between them, the fear and the rumor and the accumulated communal tension of decades ignited by the sudden removal of the authority that had suppressed it. The dying happened at a scale and a speed that overwhelmed every mechanism for recording it. Perhaps 14 million people moved. It remains the largest forced migration in human history. Now, the British officials who had administered India for decades were largely gone by the time the worst of the violence occurred. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, had accelerated the timetable for independence, originally set for June 1948, to August 1947, partly from a conviction that delay would make the communal tension worse, partly from a desire to be done before the situation became unmanageable. Whether the acceleration helped or hurt is an argument historians have not resolved. What is not in dispute is that the administrative capacity to manage the transition, the police, the civil service, the military units that might have contained the violence, had been designed for British governance and had not been replaced with anything adequate before the British left. The cost of leaving, like the cost of arriving, was paid by someone else. Cyril Radcliffe destroyed his papers after returning to England. He never spoke publicly about the experience. He declined all invitations to comment on what he had done or how he had done it. A colleague who knew him well said, years later, that Radcliffe seemed to have decided that the wisest response to what had happened was silence. He accepted the fee for his work, £1,000, and donated it to charity. He lived until 1977, long enough to see the consequences of the line he had drawn play out across 3 wars between India and Pakistan, across the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, across decades of conflict in Kashmir that continued past his death and continues still. The line he drew in 5 weeks has been producing consequences for 77 years. The independence ceremonies that followed across the next 2 decades had a quality that people who attended them described repeatedly with the same word: strange. A flag came down, a flag went up, a speech was made, hands were shaken. The British officials who had run the territory packed their things into crates, and the crates went onto ships, and the ships went to Southampton, and the territory was left with a government and a civil service and a military and a set of institutions designed by the departing power for purposes the departing power had found useful, which were not always the purposes the new government needed. Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, Zambia in 1964, Zimbabwe in 1980, after a civil war and years of guerrilla conflict. Hong Kong, the last significant transfer, in 1997. In each independence was its own story, with its own specific history of resistance and negotiation and violence and compromise. There is no single narrative of decolonization that does justice to the particular experience of each country. But there are patterns, the borders the empire had drawn, at Berlin in 1884, by Radcliffe in 1947, by various administrators in various offices across a century of mapping territories whose human complexity they did not fully understand and were not required to. Those borders remained. The new nations inherited them because the alternative was a renegotiation of every line on every map simultaneously, which the international system, designed around the principle of territorial integrity, was not equipped to manage. The borders that made administrative sense to a colonial power, that grouped different peoples together for ease of governance, that separated peoples who had lived as a single community, that drew straight lines across landscapes that had never had straight lines in them, became the borders of sovereign nations. The conflicts those borders contained became the internal politics of those nations, or the wars between them, or the insurgencies that ran for decades in the places where the line had cut through something that did not want to be cut. Nigeria's borders, drawn to contain the administrative unit the British had found convenient, enclosed three major ethnic groups: Hausa Fulani, Yoruba, Igbo, and hundreds of smaller ones with distinct languages, distinct political traditions, distinct ideas about what a state was for. 3 years after independence, the fault lines the borders had created produced a civil war that killed between 1 and 3 million people. This is not to say that pre-colonial Africa had no conflicts, or that the borders caused everything, or that different borders would have guaranteed peace. History does not run controlled experiments, but the specific shape of the conflicts, who fought whom, where the lines were drawn, which communities found themselves on which side of which division, was structured in important ways by the cartography of the colonial period. The empire drew the map. The map outlasted the empire. The map is still producing its consequences. Now, there is a more direct line between the empire and the present that runs not through Africa or India, but through the streets of Brixton and Notting Hill and Wolverhampton. It begins with a letter and a ship and an invitation that turned out to be conditional in ways nobody stated at the time. In 1948, the British Nationality Act confirmed that citizens of all Commonwealth countries had the right to live and work in the United Kingdom. This was not a humanitarian gesture. Britain in 1948 was rebuilding. The bombed cities, the exhausted infrastructure, the National Health Service that the Labour government had just created and needed staff to run. It needed workers. The workers were available in the Caribbean islands that had been British colonies for 3 centuries and whose populations had grown up understanding themselves, not unreasonably, to be British subjects in a meaningful sense. They had fought in British armies. They had paid taxes to the British Crown. They had been educated in British schools and read British books and celebrated British occasions. They were, in the way the Empire had always defined belonging when it found belonging useful, British. The Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury on the 22nd of June, 1948, carrying 492 passengers from Jamaica. They had come because the government had told them they were welcome. They came to work on the buses and in the hospitals and on the construction sites of a country that needed them and would go on needing them for decades. They arrived to a welcome that was, in practice, considerably more complicated than the law suggested. There were boarding houses with signs that read, "No blacks," "No Irish," "No dogs." There were workplaces that promoted around them. There were communities that made clear, in the ways that communities have always made clear such things without stating them directly, that belonging was conditional in ways the law did not specify. They stayed. They worked. They raised children who were born British in the full legal sense and grew up British in the full cultural sense and built lives in British cities that were, by any reasonable measure, as British as the lives of anyone else living in those cities. And then, in 2018, something happened. The Home Office, implementing an immigration enforcement policy that had been building in severity across several governments, began detaining and deporting members of the Windrush generation, the original arrivals, and, in some cases, their children. If the legal basis for their presence in Britain had always been the 1948 Act and subsequent legislation. But the Home Office, under pressure to reduce immigration numbers, had begun requiring documentary proof of legal status, passports, visa stamps, the kind of paper trail that someone who arrived in Britain as a child in 1953 and had lived there without interruption for 65 years might reasonably not have preserved in a filing cabinet. The landing cards that could have proven arrival dates, documents the Home Office itself had maintained, had been destroyed in 2010. Destroyed by the Home Office. Without those documents, people who had lived in Britain for decades, who had worked in Britain, paid taxes in Britain, raised their children in Britain, found themselves classified as illegal immigrants. They were detained. Some were deported to countries they had left as children and did not recognize as home. Some lost their jobs when employers were informed of their uncertain status. Some lost their housing. At least 11 people died while their cases were unresolved, having been denied NHS treatment they had paid into for decades because their entitlement to it was under review. The Home Secretary resigned, the government apologized, a compensation scheme was established. As of 2023, the majority of people eligible for compensation under that scheme had not received it. The Windrush generation did not come to Britain by accident. They came because an empire that had spent 3 centuries extracting labor and resources from the Caribbean had left those islands with economies that could not easily absorb their populations. And because that same empire, in the moment of its post-war reconstruction, needed the labor those populations could provide. The movement was a consequence of the empire, as direct and logical as any other consequence in this story. And what happened to the Windrush generation in Britain? The welcome that was conditional, the belonging that was contingent, the documents that were destroyed, and the people who were deported. Is the empire's operating logic running in a domestic setting decades after the last flag came down? The labor was wanted. The people providing it were, when convenient, and something less than fully included in the thing they were helping to build. Someone else built the hospitals. Someone else drove the buses. Someone else paid the cost. The ledger recorded the output, and not the people who produced it. And when the accounting was finally forced into the open, when even a home office could no longer process the contradiction without it becoming a public scandal, the compensation went to the people who had already survived the worst of it, slowly, partially, years late. The machine had changed its name again. It always changed its name. The logic did not change. The British Empire is over as a political structure. The red map that covered a quarter of the Earth's surface in 1920 has been replaced, piece by piece, by the flags of the nations that emerged from under it. What remains is harder to map. The wealth generated by 3 centuries of extraction sits in institutions that have not moved, in the endowments of universities, in the collections of museums that hold objects removed from their countries of origin, in circumstances the removing parties called acquisition, and the countries of origin call theft. The British Museum holds the Rosetta Stone, removed from Egypt in 1802. It holds the Elgin marbles, removed from Athens at roughly the same time. It holds thousands of objects from India, from West Africa, from the Pacific, gathered over centuries of contact that was rarely conducted on equal terms. The borders the empire drew still produce their consequences. Kashmir is still contested, its specific shape determined by Radcliffe's Line and the rushed partition of 1947. The Kurdish people, divided between Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria by borders drawn after the First World War, still do not have a state. The tensions in Nigeria, in Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, states whose borders were drawn in European offices for European administrative convenience, continue to generate the political instability that the countries themselves bear, and the countries that drew the borders are not required to address. The debt Britain borrowed in 1833 to compensate slaveholders was paid off by British taxpayers in 2015. The enslaved people and their descendants were never compensated. Several Caribbean nations have formally requested reparations. The British government's response has been that these are matters for discussion rather than obligation. None of this is to say that Britain has no achievements worth counting. The National Health Service. The abolition of the slave trade at significant political cost 30 years before America. The legal and institutional frameworks the empire left behind in some of its former territories, which have proven more durable and more functional than the critics of empire sometimes acknowledge. The English language spread by compulsion and become, whatever one thinks of how it was imposed, a genuine instrument of global communication. These things exist. They are part of the accounting, but so is everything else. The full accounting includes Bengal in 1770 and Bengal in 1943, the Zong, the compensation paid to slaveholders, and the apprenticeship imposed on the enslaved. Jallianwala Bagh, the Radcliffe Line, the Windrush deportations, the compensation scheme that is not paid out. The empire kept very careful books. It was precise about what went into the ledger and what did not. The profits were recorded. The costs were placed somewhere the ledger did not look. The costs did not disappear. They became someone else's inheritance. What began with a bankrupt queen licensing a privateer to steal from Spanish ships continued with a clerk's son bribing a general to hand over a province, scaled through the Atlantic trade and the sugar plantations and the Lancashire mills and the ideology that made extraction sound like generosity, survived 2 world wars that destroyed its balance sheet and left it with a map it could no longer afford to hold, ended piece by piece with flags lowered and crates packed and lines drawn by men who left before the consequences arrived. What all of that became in the end is this: a set of conditions the world is still living inside. The borders, the wealth distribution, the political instabilities, the migrations, the museums, the debts, the compensation schemes that have not paid out. All of it shaped, in significant part, by 3 centuries of decisions made by a small island off the northwest coast of Europe that found a mechanism for making the bill land somewhere else. The mechanism worked for a very long time, long enough to build the largest empire in history, long enough to fund an industrial revolution, long enough to produce, in 1920, a map so red it seemed to suggest permanence. And then the bill arrived. From every direction at once, from the colonies that no longer consented to be governed, from the creditors who no longer extended the debt, from the wars that destroyed the balance sheet, from the people who had spent generations asking the question the empire had no honest answer for. The bill is still being paid, not by the people who ran up the tab, but by the people who inherited the consequences in Kingston and Karachi and Nairobi and the housing estates of Brixton and the detention centers of a home office that destroyed the documents and then deported the people the documents would have protected. And somewhere in all of that, in the distance between what was promised and what was delivered, in the gap between what the ledger recorded and what the ledger cost, is a girl whose name we never learned. 11 years old, separated from her brother in a forest in 1756, carried away in a direction the record does not name, toward a life the record does not contain. Her brother made it out. He bought his freedom. He wrote the book. He walked into the lawyer's office with the evidence that made the Zong impossible to ignore. He became, in the end, one of the most important voices in the campaign to end the trade that had taken them both. She did not get to do any of that. The trade took her, and the record closed around her and moved on to the next entry, the way records do when a system has no mechanism for counting what it costs the people inside it. The ledger is still open, but now you know what it left out.